although this is somewhat of a hazy image, you see here Aeneas carrying Anchises with Ilius below him, walking beside him as they exit Troy. This is one of the most notable images from the Aeneid. And Aeneas tells this story in the courts of Dido as he approaches her and she begs him, please tell me everything that has happened to you since you left Troy. He begins his story saying, must I renew a grief beyond description, telling how Greeks destroyed the power of Troy, that tear-stained kingdom, since I saw the worst and played a leading role. Telling the story, a Myrmidon, a Dolopian, a soldier of cruel Ulysses would shed tears. This opening becomes significant for anyone who's read Dante's Divine Comedy. Of course, the Divine Comedy picks up these legends and moves them forward. The Divine Comedy is led by Virgil, literally, as Dante needs him as a guide through the underworld. And many of the characters will use lines that sound very reminiscent. You can almost imagine that Dante would have read Virgil every day, the way that he draws on his stories. In Visions of the Underworld, Dante will speak to different sinners and ask them their stories, and they always respond similarly to Aeneas. Must I tell you of the grief I bear? You know, to tell it would make the hardest heart weep on behalf of me, right? This is how the sinners respond. They don't want to tell the story of why it is that they are in hell. And Aeneas, then, if we can read backwards this story of the Divine Comedy, he doesn't want to tell why it is that he has suffered such agony. And he even says, not just the hardest heart, but a Myrmidon, right? Achilles, or a soldier of Ulysses would even cry to hear about what they have suffered. And we get to hear the truth of this statement when we hear from Diomedes later in the Aeneid, and Diomedes will say, I have nothing against the Trojans. That war caused nothing but pain. All of us still cry to think what happened, and all of us suffered. Aeneas was so brave and uplifts him. And so we'll look at that later. But Aeneas is speaking truthfully here when he says, even the Greeks would cry to hear what it is that we have suffered during the fall of Troy. And then he goes on and tells the actual story of the fall of Troy. So how is it that Aeneas was able to get out of Troy without dying, without being one of those many men who died? This is a problem that Virgil the poet has to answer, because if Aeneas is still going to look like he cares about those around him, then how did he get out of Troy? Because a man who fled from Troy would look like a coward. A man who only sought his own good and fled the city while it was burning to the ground would look like is not a pious figure, is not someone who should be the founder of the Roman people. And yet at the same time, he can't have someone who runs into the city and fights, because the fighting would only lead to his death. There would be no way of escape except as a prisoner or as a corpse at the end of the fall of Troy. And so he has to find a way that makes Aeneas look like he was acting pious while he left the burning city of Troy. He does this by first giving Aeneas a premonition from Hector. So there's intervention from the other worlds. Hector visits Aeneas in his dreams. I saw a desolate Hector in my dreams, streaming with tears and black with dust and blood. His feet were swollen with the thongs that pierced them when he was dragged behind the chariot, and in that dream I wept. You notice here that the description of Hector looks very similar to the corpse of Hector. This will happen again when we get to the underworld. That the afterlife shade actually resembles the corpse of the person who died. This is something that did not happen in the Odyssey. You didn't have the characters still looking like their corpses, but we will have the dead characters in the Aeneid still look like their corpses. They still retain the scars of the world that they lived in. And of course, Dante will pick this up as well in the Divine Comedy. When you have characters who are beheaded or who have been split apart, they are still bearing the signs of how they died. Hector visits Aeneas and greeted that brave man, Aeneas said, with mournful words. He says to Hector, "Light of our country, truest hope of Troy, why were you gone so long?" And Hector responds, "Child of the goddess, run. Escape these flames, the walls are seized, Troy falls from its great height." So here we have the heir of Troy who has died, now telling the living heir of Troy to get out of Troy. So you have not really a divine sanction upon Aeneas fleeing Troy, but you do have an otherworldly, right? This light of Troy, the truest hope of all Trojans, saying, Troy has fallen. This isn't up for debate. This isn't, can you still fight and stand and make sure Troy doesn't fall? He is telling him with finality, run, child of the goddess, because Troy is done. Don't go look for yourselves to see whether Troy is done. Troy is done. I'm telling you ahead of time. Get out of here. Now, Aeneas doesn't listen, and I think this is another masterstroke by Virgil to not have him listen at this moment. If you would have think about his contemporary readers, on what basis would he have just run? Because a ghost tells him to. In some sense, he would have had to see for himself and also have divine intervention. He needs several different people telling him it is okay to leave, so that the audience would recognize Aeneas did the pious thing by leaving the fallen Troy. So Aeneas readies himself for battle and heads into the city. When he heads into the city, furor, rage, pitches his mind. So he becomes so angry that he begins to fight. And in this moment, as he's trying to fight and everyone around him is falling, he sees Priam fall, and it feels as though he has watched Anchises actually be killed in front of him, which would have been his uncle, so it would have been someone close to him falling, but he sees a premonition in a sense of this is what it will look like if his father falls, and begins to hurt over this loss. And that's when he sees Helen. For both lands, she was a fury. Again, remember these words are going to come up over and over again. When do we call someone a fury? When does furor matter? A loathsome thing, she crouches beneath the altar. My heart caught fire. I had to punish her for crimes that had destroyed the fatherland. And if you look at this language of the fatherland, over and over again, Aeneas will be called Father Aeneas. And so we are picking up the image that this former fatherland, Aeneas inherits and then becomes the father of Rome. So he's the father of a new fatherland, which is the Roman Empire. But we have to hear him talk about the fatherland of Troy to get the sense of what is he the father of? What does it mean to have a fatherland by how this father responds to his former fatherland? When he sees Helen, notice the language of fury, furor, rage, burning. This is the moment in which the passions could overtake him, and he could not respond piously by killing Helen. If he would have killed Helen in this moment, we would have not recognized him as pious Aeneas. He would have been like all the other soldiers who were heading into the fight, who were not listening to the gods in this moment. We would have seen him almost like, we also see Achilles' son kill Priam. We would have seen him in that kind of blind rage, not having a greater fate that he must respond to and hold back from this rage, which would have lost him his fate. His mother holds him back. Now, this is book 2 of the Aeneid. His mother holds him back. The same thing happened in book 1 of the Iliad. Athena steps in and holds Achilles back. She restrains him from drawing his sword against Agamemnon. Here we have Aeneas being restrained by a goddess from using his sword against Helen. And she says, "Have faith in me, my son, and follow me out of the city," which he then does. So we have Hector telling Aeneas to leave. We have this vision of Priam dying, which makes him pious unto his father to not make sure his father does not die in these last moments of Troy. And then we have a goddess actually intervening and telling him to leave Troy. And there will be at least one other person telling him to leave Troy. As I've mentioned, this image of carrying Anchises out that he describes here becomes the primary image of all of the Aeneid. This is the icon of the Aeneid, is Aeneas carrying the past of Troy with him as the future follows. And there's Ilius leaving with him. Dear Father, let them set you on my shoulders. I'll carry you. You will not weigh me down. Whatever happens, it will be one peril or rescue for us both. Our little Ilius will walk with me. My wife will follow far back. A lot of people have tried to explore these lines and what it means. So figuratively, he's carrying Anchises, he's carrying the legends of Troy, he's carrying what it means to be a Trojan on his back with him, and he has Ilius who he's leading as he's going to pass on to the next generation. So this is like paideia at work, right? The past being brought forward to the future generations. But there is this moment when we look literally that he tells Creusa, his wife, my wife will follow far back. Perhaps it could have been understandable if he would have just said, my wife will follow, but he actually almost gives her a command to stay far back. And this is a moment that scholars love to argue about. Why did he tell her to stay far back? It sounds as though he's trying to get her killed. We don't know if this is because he's talking to Dido and saying, I've moved on, and this was already meant to be. I was supposed to move on from her. I had already set it up so that she was far behind me. If this is something that Virgil would have revised and crossed out, because why have her far back? Or was he just telling himself mentally, here's a little note, remember to go back to this moment and find out why she would have been far behind? Either way, she is far behind. She does get lost as they exit the city. And then he runs back into the city to try and find her, and is instead met with her ghost. And this is the last person that tells him that it's okay to leave Troy, is the ghost of his wife, Creusa. Creusa's ghost appears to him, the sad apparition, he recalls, came to me taller than the living woman. Remember, goddesses are taller than living women, and so therefore, in this moment, he's kind of exalting her to the status of a goddess. But what she said was soothing to my soul. So rather than cry over her loss here, he said that she soothes him with her words. Why do you rave and revel in this sorrow? It was by the will of heaven. It is not right to take me. So weep no longer. In this moment when the apparition appears, she has almost the stature of a goddess, telling him again to leave Troy. He can't take her with him, and it is divine will. Therefore, he can't be emotional about it, right? Don't rave and revel in the sorrow because it was fated. And again, this gives us kind of the idea, the Stoic idea of moving on with one's duty despite the emotional hang-ups or hold-ups that would keep you from following piously what you are meant to do by heaven. And 3 times he tries to throw himself around her neck, and 3 times, of course, he cannot hug an apparition. This 3 times moment will be repeated throughout the narrative, so pay attention through the epic poem when you see this 3 times. If you remember in the Odyssey, when Odysseus sees Anticlea, 3 times he tries to throw his arm around her, and 3 times he cannot hug a ghost, right? He cannot hug a shade. And this will happen again when we go into the underworld. 3 times he will try to hug his father, and 3 times he will be unable to hug an apparition. So we're getting kind of the cyclical effect that we've seen in other epics in which the patterns are going to increase with intensity. This is our first moment of the 3 times, and it will have greater significance as it bears more weight throughout the poem. I mentioned that I will focus more on fate, fatum. What does fatum mean? Literally, it means what is said, what is being done. These are the words that tell Aeneas what it is that he is meant to do. What is the fate of Aeneas? And he talks about it in the story that he tells Dido in book 3. As he's talking about his travels, as he's relating to her the things that he was meant to do, he tells it in such a way that it is not the cursory journey of Odysseus in which he goes from island to island, and it is this kind of cyclical adventure in which he's always trying to get home and constantly waylaid. Instead, what seems to happen is that as he's leaving Troy, really unsure of what his destiny is, but hearing from everyone that he is meant to go forward, right? That he is meant to move on, he starts to hear more about what this means. He finds himself in a dream in which his household gods talk to him and tell him that he's going to Italy, that that's his new destiny, is to go to Italy. And he relates this dream to his father Anchises, who is still living at this time. And Anchises remembers, oh yeah, Cassandra. Remember, Cassandra is the one who will always tell prophecies and no one will ever listen. And Cassandra is actually raped in the fall of Troy and has a own sad story of her own later. But Anchises responds to this story by saying, Cassandra told us that our future lied in the west, in Italy, and that Italy was going to be where our people go. Also, while he's on an island where he gets to see Andromache, who was taken away by the Greeks, but then finds a new husband, and we get to see her here, and she responds to the sweet Iülus by missing her own son, Astyanax, who was thrown off the walls of Troy by Achilles' son. And here she says, you know, my son would have been as old as you are. And so there's kind of this tender moment that takes place between him and Andromache. But the reason he's telling the story has much more to do with the prophecy that he gets to hear at this point, in which he is told that he will know his place in Italy. He will know where to found the new city when he gets to see a sow, a white sow with 30 piglets. And the 30 will then signify the 30 years he will be there before his son Iülus must then go and found another city. And so we have this series of prophecies that control the narrative rather than a series of adventures. So even though we go to places like Scylla and Charybdis and Cyclops Islands, the adventures are not as significant as the prophecies that Aeneas is collecting that begin to make him aware of what exactly is his fate. The narrative then concludes with the death of Anchises and Father Aeneas told of the fate the gods sent and his travels. And the fate becomes the primary emphasis in that narrative, and that ends book 3.